Okay, so let's start. So, good afternoon. So, it's great honor for us to be here today, and we have that fantastic panelist today. So Eric Berger, he's a research professor at Georgetown University, and I work with him for the blockchain research. And Steve Crocker, he's an internet pioneer and the father of RFC request comment. And Patrick Ryan, he's a grassroots engineer and who knows the engineering committee and the relationship with engineer and the engineer community governance, I think. And Yuta Takanashi, he's a senior fellow at the Georgetown University, and he's come from Japanese financial service agencies. This is a regulatory authority in Japan. And this morning, we reviewed that National Action Plan by Chamber of Digital Commerce. And in that document, stakeholder is one of the keywords and for future ecosystem. And in the morning session regarding the ICO and STO session, the panelists say that collaboration among stakeholders is important. This is a great introduction of this panel discussion. And this panel discussion is intended to explore the possibility of collaborative environment among stakeholders to establish a healthy governance of blockchain-based financial systems. And let me start with a key slide. We have the 4 kinds of stakeholders for the blockchain. One is the regulators, the other is open source style engineers, the third is the business entity, and the fourth is consumers. The one of the main problem is the regulators do not understand that technology well, and there's no common language to communicate among regulators and open source style engineers. And the open source style engineers do not want to talk with regulators, unfortunately, especially for the cypherpunks. And the business side want to avoid friction to the regulators, and they start a business before maturing technology. And the consumers do not have transparency to do the due diligence of the technology, what business entity did. And the permissionlessness is the main source of innovation-based blockchain. And the bad news is the current relationship among stakeholders is messy and hard to solve. But so we have a good news that we have a great success history of the internet through multi-stakeholder discussion process. And let us discuss about how that kind of process can help to establish a healthy governance of the blockchain. And I would like to start that first question to Yuta, to the regulatory authority. So what is the main concern of the blockchain-based financial activities that derived you to think about the governance issues?
Yeah, actually, the financial regulators have several financial regulatory goals. Like one is like the financial stability, and the other is like preventing financial crimes or consumer and the investor protection. All these regulatory goals is very important to the society. And currently, most of the regulatory goals is achieved through the regulation on the financial institutions, like banks. But when the blockchain comes in, especially the public blockchain comes in, the landscape will change. Like the blockchain can disintermediate financial activities. So that means we don't need banks or insurance companies anymore. And from the regulatory perspective, we use a target to regulate. So some of the regulators think about like shifting from regulating the entities to the regulating activity. But the regulating activity is a little bit difficult because sometimes it takes much more like resources to policing the activity. And also sometimes blockchain will provide anonymization technology. Like, that means the regulators cannot know who does what in the system. So, and even more like sophisticated like anonymization technologies comes in right now. So like the Lightning Network is also anonymized, and also some of the anonymization coins is utilized. So this kind of the shift of the power from the regulators to the protocol is making it difficult. The other aspect of the blockchain is like So anyone can create this new system from all over the world. So if they have the access to internet, it's easy to distribute their program. So it's much easier to creating new services without permission. And also, once the system starts its operation, it's very difficult to stop from the single party's effort, including regulators. So if there's any problems in the system, we cannot stop. So this is a whole new paradigm. So of course, it is very difficult to predict what will happen in the future. So how much this new system will be utilized in the financial system is unclear right now. But from the regulatory perspective, we want to enjoy the benefit of the innovation, but at the same time, we need to achieve the regulatory goals, regardless of the technology used in the financial system. But the question is how we can achieve, especially in the more decentralized, autonomous, and permissionless innovations utilized in the financial system. Probably it becomes more difficult than currently. Then the good news is the regulatory community already started discussion about this. So the Financial Stability Board has just published their working program recently, and within it, they decided to publish some report on the implication for the financial stability from the decentralized financial technologies. And they will publish the report in June this year. So the discussion started, but still lots of uncertainties around here.
Okay, I understand that. So that good news is that regulatory authority, a group of regulatory authorities started the discussion among them. But so I have one more question about that. Okay, so regulatory authority, group of regulatory authorities like FSB or government has enough capability to think about the technology issue, because that most of issues coming from the technology.
Yeah, that is a very big question. So of course, I think most of the regulators recognize that importance to understand technology or increase our capability in the technology space. But at the same time, it's very difficult because entire ecosystem, like in the blockchain ecosystem, the engineering or technology specialist is in the shortage, and we need increase the capacity to understand technology, but it's hard, actually.
Okay. So this is the reason why. So I would like to ask so the second question to Patrick. And okay, so you represent that, so the engineering committee. And my question is how engineering communities think about that risks. So what you just said, and is it possible for your community to solve that kind of problem with utilizing your expertise?
Thank you. Let me give a disclaimer first that I'm not officially an engineer, although I play one on TV, and I'm always happy to be confused for one because I'm a recovering lawyer. My work, though, my career has been in managing engineering projects, and I have another secret at Google. My day job, I'm an engineering program manager, and I deal with launches of different products. And so I'm going to talk about some of the innovation opportunities between the private sector and the blockchain, using that as an example. But I do want to emphasize that I'm not here on behalf of Google. I'm here in my own capacity and in my capacity as an academic and as an author about internet governance. There are two different blockchains conceptually. There's the blockchain that we've discussed today, which is the financial sector blockchain, the private version of the blockchain. And that is a blockchain that is characterized by being decentralized and by providing a lot of new features and functionality to the financial sector that is new and exciting. The difference, one of the big differences between the internet and blockchain in its regulation and governance is that the people that founded and developed the internet are still with us and influencing it, whereas the people that developed the blockchain technologies and launched it are also still with us, but they're anonymous and pseudonymous for the most part. We're here today with Steve Crocker, who's one of the original internet pioneers, and for decades he's been out with Vint, Surf, and many others talking about how the internet originally was intended and how it's developed over time and influencing that. Satoshi Nakamoto is not here today.
I believe.
We don't think so.
We don't know, exactly. But there's a big difference between the types of engineering representation that exists and originally developed the blockchain versus that developed the internet. And so the governance systems that are going to apply to each of those are also going to be different, and they're going to be very difficult. Here's the challenge. I would say that the engineers in the first version of the blockchain, the one we're talking about today, the private sector version, are focused on optimizing distributed networks. They're focused on distributed networks. Whereas if we were to talk about the original blockchain inventors, people like Satoshi Nakamoto, they focused not on decentralization, but on distribution, but on decentralization. And there's a big difference. And so I'm not a huge originalist, but I think it's worth reading just the very first 2 lines from the Bitcoin white paper, because a lot of people haven't. And it's really important, particularly in the context of what we're talking about today. Commerce on the internet has come to rely almost exclusively on financial institutions serving as trusted third parties to process electronic payments. While the system works well enough for most transactions, it still suffers from the inherent weakness of the trust-based model. Bitcoin is founded on the principle of breaking this whole thing apart, of breaking away the financial sector. There's not a version of the financial sector in many engineers' minds that works. The whole thing is broken. Whether or not that's actually true is a question of debate, but the question of whether or not engineers in the engineering community of blockchain believe that, I don't believe is up for debate. And if we look around at today, the market capitalization of the coins themselves, not the investment into the development necessarily, but the coins themselves, is far greater with these decentralized community coins. Bitcoin itself is one good example. So the challenge when we have to deal with this from a governance perspective, I think, is 2 different things. It's relatively easy to deal with the first version, the private sector version, because we are mapping known requirements that the SEC has had since 1930 onto a new technology. It's awkward, and there are things to do that we need to do better, and there's still opportunity at the back end. The challenge is engaging with a community that is full of hackers that are like Satoshi Nakamoto. We don't know their real name. We don't know if they have multiple presence. And government employees and regulators aren't very familiar with engaging with this particular community. Most of it happens on platforms that most of us don't use, platforms like Discord that maybe our children use, or Telegram. And the style of engagement is very different. And so I'll just give one example of why it's worthwhile, and then I'll move on. But the innovation is absolutely outstanding. At Google, we spin up teams all the time to build new products. One of the biggest tragedies is that we have competing teams that will go to build a product, and then one doesn't make it, and then one does. But the one that doesn't make it has a lot of great ideas frequently, and it's gone. It goes into the memory hole of Google, right? Maybe it'll make it out if somebody has an idea and goes to another company. In the blockchain, it's very different. If you log on to Discord and start to spend some time in some of the channels in some of these communities, you'll see innovation. It's like walking into the boardroom of Google or walking into any of the project rooms of Facebook in order to kind of see what people are talking about. And you can just jump right into the conversation. And that, I think, is a prize that's really worth valuing, because it's bringing a lot of innovation here to the industry, and including innovations the private sector is using. If we have time at the end, I'll have some suggestions on how I think the government can get to that.
Thank you. And I think that so many persons say, and I say that so there is many similarity between the blockchain and the internet. So this is the source of the permissionless innovation, and so many mathematics or many rules comes from the grassroots, and I would like to move to the discussion about that similarity between the blockchain and the internet, and I would like to pass the mic to the Steve, and to explain that what the internet governance is, and okay, move to the slide decks of Steve, and I'd like to pass the microphone to explain that.
So I get trotted out here as sort of the old man from history. as if that's relevant, and I'm going to try. I don't know if I'll succeed, and I suspect that the unstated objective is also to have somebody to blame for all the things that went wrong. I can describe what we were doing way back when, and maybe that's relevant. I'm on solid ground in describing that, and then things get a little squishier as we try to apply that, because one of the caveats, one of the cautions is just because what we did turned out reasonably well doesn't mean that you can take that as a template and say that's the solution to all problems that look anything like it. So with that as a cautionary note, when we were building the ARPANET, and now we're going back 50 years, full 50 years, in 68, 69, 70, 71, the challenge was a technical challenge. How do you hook up a whole bunch of different computers that had never been built with the anticipation they were going to be connected to anything, much less computers built by some competing vendor? The idea of a network was new. The use of packet switching technology was new. A lot of ad hoc stuff was built. And one of the very positive things is that it was a captured environment. The money was all coming from a single source, from an office within the Advanced Research Projects Agency. And money speaks, that's the same now as it was then, I think. And so that was very powerful. It removed a lot of roadblocks, and it created a lot of easy cooperation. You didn't have to ask, should I talk to this person? Do I care about the intellectual property? Those questions they mostly didn't arise. One or two small cases, but they were disposed of very quickly. But nonetheless, we didn't have much of a roadmap for how we were going to connect these machines, what they were going to say to each other. And I'm speaking from the perspective of the people who were at the sites that were being connected. There was a different set of people who were building the packet switches, the IMPs as they were called in those days, and worrying about packet switching technology. But from the point of view of those of us who were at the hosts, it was in essence a black box. You stick a message in and a message would come out at the other end, and you could presume that it was coming out intact. And security was less important in those days. There weren't as many bad guys floating around, so you didn't have to worry too much about the stuff being tampered with, although we worried a little about it, but not much. But even so, yes, I had to figure out what are you going to do with it. So there was an ad hoc self-organizing process where those of us at each of the sites started to talk to each other and say, okay, what do we want to accomplish? Some of the objectives were easy. You wanted to be able to log in remotely. You wanted to be able to move a file. And there were a certain set of people whose vision was limited, was focused on just that. Get that working and you're in good shape. And there are a different set of people, of which I was one, said, well, wait a minute, that's pretty easy stuff. There surely is much more complicated stuff. We don't know what it is, but we want to leave things open so that that can be done. So building a framework that could be built on was a very big piece of the original thinking. Another big piece of the thinking was a lack of ownership in a practical sense, that we wanted to share everything. And the sharing was really both of an active, anybody could come in and participate, you had ideas, you wanted to design a protocol, and of a passive kind in the sense that you wanted to know what was going on, all of the documents available to anybody free of charge anywhere, anytime. That turned out, all those things, but particularly the last, turned out to be enormously powerful. I made a first trip kind of late in my career to India in 1994. Went to the Indian Institute of Science, gave a talk, and was introduced to a graduate student who had built a rather amazing mashup of different technologies. And I asked him, how'd you learn to do all that? Because it was fairly sophisticated stuff. He said, I just downloaded the RFCs, read them, and started writing code. And it actually brought tears to my eyes. I mean, it's enormously powerful to have all that information available. And in comparison to what standards bodies of the day, and to some extent still, but less, you had to be a member of something, you had to pay fees, you had to go through a lot of rigmarole to get any information. Totally different, sort of inside out kind of thing. And in the end, as we've all seen, that kind of technology and the implied, sort of the implicit lightweight governance and freedom that came, wound up turning the whole telephone system inside out, and or upside down, or just knocked it over, if you like, to big effect. I had a conversation once in a meeting with where I was one of the very few internet people, surprisingly, and a bunch of telephone people, particularly concerned with national security, and I found myself being called upon to explain how standards were developed in the internet. So I explained about the open process and the Internet Engineering Task Force and the documents that we call requests for comments that were started and became the mainstay for publishing these things. And then the critical point was that there's no organization that tells everybody that they have to implement. That's done through market force. So the standards are agreed upon through a consensus process, and then vendors decide, and operators, network operators decide that they're going to implement that. The network effect, as it's called, takes place very rapidly. As soon as a few people start doing something, it becomes advantageous for everybody else to join in. And this very senior, quite distinguished and quite senior guy responded to me. He said, "So you don't have any standards?" And I said, "No, let me explain it to you again." So I went through it again. He says, "You don't have any standards. Let me tell you what standards are. We go into a room, we write down the standards, and when we promulgate them, everybody has to implement it." I said, "That's what standards are." And I said, "Well," and that's why the telephone company is going away. And we agreed not to have any more discussion. So I mentioned requests for comments. This was a whimsical idea that didn't go away as quickly as we thought it was going to go. It didn't go away at all. When we were first starting out, there was a question of what should we write down and who should we send things to and so forth. And a handful of us who had been meeting intermittently decided that we'd write memos, and I took on the task of trying to organize the memos, and I thought it was trivial, and then took a couple of stabs at it, and a couple of weeks passed, and I realized I was under a lot of pressure to get rid of this little chore, and I realized what my problem was. I thought that in those days we were just graduates, we had no charter, we had no formalities, and nobody come and anointed us and said we were in charge of anything, and I was fearful that even if we wrote down our most modest thoughts, that it might generate a backlash, that somebody senior, an adult, most of us were in the West Coast, we thought somebody from the East would come. I didn't know there'd be Boston or Washington, but I was sure somebody would come from that direction and say, "Who are you? We're in charge," etc. So I said, let's make make the barrier as low as possible. And I scribbled a couple of sentences to say these things have no status. Write down anything. They could be an incomplete design. They could be a question without an answer. They can be whatever you want. And then to emphasize that, I borrowed the term request for comments, and I said, and as a matter of form, we'll put the term request for comments on every single one of these notes, no matter whether it's a one-sentence thing or whether it's a whole tome, or whatever. And I figured that was good for about 6 months. That was 50 years ago. It was April '69. Would never have guessed that it would survive. It's transformed quite a bit. Those RFCs were things that we sent, we printed and sent by U.S. mail to each other. Now they're distributed through the network, of course. And email and other mechanisms are used to do most of the early development, and so by the time things get transformed into an RFC, they're already much more formal. So, but all of that is pretty normal over a long period of development. But it was very powerful, and as I said when I opened, to be cautious about what lessons you take from all of this. But I think that free communication in some form, doesn't have to be RFC particular, but free communication and open communication is very helpful in developing things.
For the great informative explanation. And so I'd like to move to Eric, and Eric has a main person to give a standard for the voice over IP using that multi-stakeholder approach over IETF. And could you give me some your lesson when you create a standard over this process?
Yeah, I'd love to. Although I absolutely have to give the disclaimer because we were talking about communications and that I'm talking in my Georgetown capacity and not in my other retail job right now. So yeah, if we go back and really building on what Steve said, if you go back to the late 70s, early 80s, there was a mini battle going on in standards for communications in general. And it was the IETF model versus ISO, to the point where some of those people on the East Coast did say we want standards. In fact, we'll mandate that the U.S. government will buy gossip, will buy the OSI. I see a few people nodding their heads. Oh yeah, I remember that, and a whole bunch of other people going, gossip? What's that? In fact, that's the point. Is that TCP/IP, the IETF model, won that out for various numbers of reasons. And you fast forward to around 2000, 1997, 98, 99, this voice over internet thing was starting to happen. And that actually is very similar. I see a lot of parallels to what we're seeing today with blockchain and cryptocurrencies and financial regulators, where basically at that time in 2000, the regulators had no real idea what to do with this voice over IP thing, whether it was a thing to be nourished and encouraged or quashed. And I remember going to the ITU. We had a workshop on the future of voice in 2000. And it was actually very educational for me because I finally understood why some regulators wanted to quash it. And it was a bit of like what you said, Yuta. It wasn't just, I'm not going to have a job because there won't be a phone company, so what am I going to regulate? Because that was kind of the cynical view that I went in with. But what I came to learn was that for many, many countries, a large part of their revenue base was from telecommunication surcharges. And that it wasn't just, oh, we're bringing inexpensive voice service to your populace, but we're also bankrupting your hospitals and schools. And and that was like a big eye-opener, and it's a thing that, typically as an engineer sitting in those days in California or in Boston area, you don't think about. And so being exposed to that was very important. And it's very interesting to see, going from 2000 to today, the interplay between sort of the market working and kind of running, but then you hit a wall. And having that, some countries will say, you've hit the wall, we're going to ban your service, we're going to block it. Other countries which basically say, here is the social problem you've created. If you don't fix it, we'll fix it for you. And by the way, you won't like the way we'll fix it. And that tended to encourage industry and academia and just individuals to come up with novel solutions. That is why we did ask Steve, because I'm a latecomer. I started in the mid 80s. So, but this idea that in effect today, all you need is an email address and you can participate. This concept, the phrase permissionless innovation, certainly has been around forever, but I know at the Internet Society we talked a lot about it in the early 2000s. Again, this idea that in the telephone network, you needed permission from the telephone network, not necessarily because they were mean, although sometimes they were. It was just that they had to do work, whereas the whole concept of putting the intelligence at the ends and having that concept go with governance was kind of revolutionary in itself.
Okay, thank you very much. I think so. We are learning that so great history. So we created through that process of IETF or Internet like governance. And so I'd like to ask a question to Yuta and Patrick. And so we discuss about the history. So what kind of the discussion was held so in the development of the internet technology, and so what is your takeaway, and so what you learned for the governance for blockchain technology? And the first Yuta.
Okay, so I'm very much interested to listen to the history because it's very similar to right now because the financial regulators find it difficult to like decide what stance we should take, and also the way that Eric explained the history is very interesting because the financial regulators or telecom regulators said we can fix it, but you don't probably you don't want, so then you should come up with a new idea. So this kind of the interaction is very important, I think, because some of, as I mentioned, some of the regulations is more like efficiently addressed by the technology or technological solutions. So regulating, enforcing regulation through the traditional way will be very efficient. But if we have good technology, substitute this regulation will be very efficient. So if it's possible, we want to engineer to come up with a new idea. So, but unfortunately, as Matsuo-san mentioned, that there is no such kind of place to discuss, or even the communication is very difficult because there is no trust each other or no common language. So having the common place to discuss from the regulatory perspective, we want to let them know our concerns to encourage them to think about. So this kind of the interaction is very important. That is my lesson and the learning from the history.
Patrick, so do you think that the current blockchain engineers community can do the same thing like the internet engineer did?
I think that there are some serious lessons that we can learn from this, from the internet governance community that we can bring over to blockchain. We'll have to make some adaptations, some pretty significant adaptations, but there's a couple things that I think are important. First is recognition that norms matter. Norms matter in the internet and in this technology more than laws. Because it's through this multi-stakeholder system and through the protocols that are set that really govern the way the internet works. And that matters in the blockchain as well. Norms are set by peer pressure in many ways, not by government regulators, but government regulators have an important influencing factor. And this is my first, I guess I have two different things. One thing that I think we all need to do in order to get governance in the blockchain is actually recognize the digital citizen that is anonymous. That's going to be a hard thing to do because we, as government, don't meet and confer or have bilaterals with anonymous people. That's going to have to change in the future. I think that's going to take some time. But more specifically, in the norm aspect, what government can do is lean into the very strong ethic that the hacker community has. That may come as a shock to some, but it does not to several. Hackers have very clear ethics. Now, they may be bad ethics, right? There may be black hat hacker. I'm not pointing at you there. But there may be some hackers that are just out to do harm. But there are a lot of hackers that identify with doing good for the world and wanting to do good for the world and seek norms to follow. And in this world, that's very complicated because governments set a lot of the laws and norms, but don't do a very good job of setting expectations or providing, for example, a safe harbor. And that's where I think we should be headed with this, is to be able to set some safe harbor opportunities, some public statements. As my old manager at the university used to say, Phil Weiser, he used to talk a lot about regulation by raised eyebrow. That could still happen here. And I think it can have a very powerful function using some of the same principles that Steve mentioned. Open access, transparency, and there was one other, open architecture. These are all things that are just good for a community. And if we could even add in one other aspect of like a no pre-mine, this idea of taking money before it's gone to the community, I think governments can have a very powerful statement by saying, we may not investigate you as long as you follow certain norms. And it's the first step in engaging with this community. An awkward one, but I think an important one.
Great. And so my question to Steve is, do you think that this kind of multi-stakeholder discussion approach can be effective for also for blockchain, future of the blockchain?
Yeah, so the term multi-stakeholder approach has gained currency, at least in my experience, with the creation of ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, which is relatively late in the spectrum of organizations related to the Internet. It was created in late, 1998, toward the end of 1998, to oversee the domain name system and the allocation of addresses, and not the whole operation of the Internet. And it was created deliberately as a multi-stakeholder organization, which I had to learn it was a term with a certain edge on it that had a contrast with multilateral, which meant that only governments participated. So this was wasn't stated as anti-government, and in fact we say, well, governments get to participate too. Governments have a hard time understanding the idea, what do you mean we get to participate too? We decide whether you get to participate as their normal. Anyway, one of the, let me contrast, say, the Internet Engineering Task Force, which was created and grew out of things that were much earlier. So in some sense, even its formal initiation doesn't accurately date when the processes that led into it started. ITF is fundamentally a cooperative place where people come and do work together and are all focused on an outcome that is a constructive, positive sum outcome, something good for everybody. Whereas at ICANN, the underlying assumption I had to become accustomed to was that everybody had a vested interest, and it was more a question of balancing off these vested interests rather than trying to reach constructive solutions to problems. Now, nothing's a pure case. In some cases, there are positive solutions, but in many cases, what happens in an ICANN forum in the policy development processes are people come representing predetermined views, and then they thrash that out. And one of the downsides of a system like that is that if nothing happens, that is actually advantageous to a certain segment of the community. So between blockage and sort of a close cousin capture where some group takes over, you have serious problems in these environments. And then what to say, I see the time is allegedly run out here, what to say about this in the blockchain arena is be careful about structuring the kind of governance processes that you're going to have to live with, because you got to look at what the downsides are. Can they be gamed in a way, or can they just be unintentionally not satisfactory because they don't help you move forward? They just only put roadblocks in the way.
Thank you very much, and unfortunately time is over. And but so I think that we have that a couple of hints to make the healthy communication among the among all stakeholders, including the government or regulatory authority and the cypherpunks, I think. And we believe that we can create this in the near future, like an IETF ISO for blockchain. And this is a hint from this panel discussion. And thank you for your time to have a great discussion today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.